Are you all right?
The first thing people noticed was not the wine. It was the silence before it. 300 guests filled the Crystal Lantern Ballroom that night, the kind of room built to make wealthy people feel even wealthier. Gold light poured from chandeliers shaped like hanging fire. Waiters floated between round tables with silver trays. Strings played softly near the stage. Cameras flashed at the far end of the hall, where the charity wall stood under a row of sponsor logos. Everything about the night had been polished for admiration. Everything except the woman sitting at table 7. Amara Okoye Bello sat with both hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face calm, the silver fabric of her gown catching candlelight every time she breathed. On her left wrist was a narrow indigo-beaded cuff, hand-woven, slightly worn, far too simple for a room like this. Next to her sat her husband, Darius Bello, smiling the smile that had made magazines call him one of Lagos's most magnetic young philanthropists. And then, right in the middle of the chairman's toast, Darius lifted his glass. He turned toward his wife. He laughed, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he poured red wine down the front of her gown. Gasps broke across the ballroom. The wine ran dark and slow over silver silk, spreading across her chest, down her waist, into the folds of the dress gathered in her lap. Someone at the next table dropped a fork. A woman near the stage covered her mouth. One camera flash went off by accident, lighting the whole ugly moment like it belonged in tomorrow's papers. Darius set the empty glass down and smiled like he had just told the funniest joke in the room. "Maybe now," he said loudly, "you'll stop trying to look like something you were never trained to be." A few people laughed because they did not know what else to do. A few looked away because they knew exactly what they were watching. Behind Darius, a glamorous woman in a gold gown touched his arm and smirked into her champagne flute. Rita Sane, his foundation's public relations director, had spent the last 6 months appearing wherever Amara was supposed to be. On television panels, at donor dinners, in photographs taken just close enough to feel disrespectful and just distant enough to remain deniable. At the end of the front row, an older man with silver hair stopped moving entirely. He had been silent all evening. He had not clapped during the speeches. He had not smiled for the cameras. Now he rose halfway from his chair, one hand gripping the table edge, and stared directly at Amara as though he had seen a ghost step into chandelier light. Then he whispered, once, barely audible, "Amara." And again, with something close to shock in his voice, "Amara Okoye." Darius did not hear him. Most people didn't. But the woman in the stained silver gown did. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time that night, she looked past her husband. Not at the stage, not at Rita, not at the donors, at the silent man in front. And whatever passed between them in that moment did not belong to the room. Because Darius Bello thought he had just ended his wife in public. He did not yet understand that he had only introduced her. The Lantern Hope Charity Ball was Darius Bello's favorite kind of event. Not because of the children's hospitals it claimed to support, not because of the scholarship fund attached to the evening, and not because he cared about the mothers and newborns whose photographs smiled from the LED screens on either side of the stage. Darius loved events that made his name sound heavier than it really was. He loved hearing himself announced. He loved the pause before applause. He loved the handshakes, the shoulder squeezes, the way people leaned toward him when he spoke, as if proximity itself might become useful later. Tonight had been built for him. The host had already called him a builder of futures. A banker had described him as a visionary force in modern philanthropy. One newspaper had printed a glossy spread that week calling him the man who turned compassion into scale. Only a handful of people in that ballroom knew that the bones under that beautiful public image had once belonged to someone else. And none of them expected to hear the truth tonight. Especially not Darius. He had arrived an hour early with his mother, Evelyn Bellow, who wore midnight blue silk and the expression of a woman who believed status was hereditary. Evelyn moved through the ballroom as if every flower arrangement had been placed in her honor. She greeted trustees by first name, corrected a waiter on the pronunciation of imported water, and reminded anyone who would listen that her son's keynote would define the future of private charity in the region. When Amara arrived, Evelyn barely looked at her. She only glanced once at the silver gown and said, "You could have chosen something quieter. Tonight is not your night." Amara smiled politely. "It never is," she said. Evelyn missed the meaning completely. That had been the pattern for years. People mistook Amara's stillness for surrender. They mistook her silence for emptiness. They mistook her refusal to compete for lack of value. The only people who truly understood her were the ones who had watched her work before she became Darius Bellow's wife. Before her name disappeared into his. Before her labor turned into his language. Before entire rooms were taught to see her as decorative, when she had once been the architect. 9 years earlier, Amara Okoye was not attending galas. She was riding in overheated buses to riverside communities no politician remembered after election season. She was sitting under corrugated roofs with midwives whose clinic shelves stayed empty for months. She was drawing route maps by hand for mobile maternal health units because no software company would donate the planning tools she needed. She was writing grant proposals after midnight under a flickering lamp and waking before dawn to chase signatures from local councils that liked to delay poor women's survival behind official stamps. She was not famous. She was not rich. But she was impossible to ignore if you ever saw her working. Amara had a gift that had nothing to do with performance. She could enter a problem no one powerful cared about and make it impossible for the right people to keep ignoring it. She listened better than most executives spoke. She remembered details others considered too small. She could take scattered need and turn it into structure. A broken clinic, a missing road, an unpaid nurse, a district no ambulance reached in time. To Amara, these were not tragedies to photograph. They were systems to repair. The first mobile maternal care route she designed covered 4 remote communities and 1 flooded corridor nobody wanted to fund because the roads washed out every rainy season. She found retired drivers willing to work part-time. She convinced 2 nurses to rotate weekends. She turned 1 donated van into a moving lifeline. When diesel prices climbed, she sold jewelry she had inherited from an aunt and bought fuel herself. Not once did she put her face on a poster. Not once did she ask anyone to name a wing after her. She simply kept going. That was where Kofi Aremu met her, long before the gray hair. long before the newspapers called him the quiet kingmaker of medical philanthropy, long before his family office began underwriting hospitals and innovation funds across the continent. At that time, he was only a difficult donor with precise questions and very little patience for polished fraud. He had visited one of Amara's field stations unannounced after hearing about a young woman who had somehow made a single van do the work of a permanent clinic. He found her ankle-deep in mud, sleeves rolled up, arguing with a supplier over missing delivery crates while calming a pregnant teenager at the same time. He watched for 20 minutes before introducing himself. Amara did not flatter him. She did not perform gratitude. She simply explained the route map, the staff rotation, the medicine shortage, and the exact amount she needed to stabilize operations for 6 months. At the end, she looked him in the eye and said, "If you want publicity, sponsor a gala. If you want impact, fund fuel, refrigeration, and tires." Kofi Aremu laughed so hard he had to remove his glasses. He funded her on the spot. That was the beginning of Riverlight. Not a glamorous charity, not a media brand. A maternal health network built one practical decision at a time. The indigo cuff on Amara's wrist had been woven for her by one of the first midwives in the program after their second mobile unit survived flood season without losing a single patient. She wore it every year on the date Riverlight officially opened. Tonight was that date. Darius never remembered. Darius entered her life 2 years after Riverlight began attracting notice from serious donors. He was handsome, polished, ambitious, and extraordinarily quick at learning which words made generous people feel wise. At the time, he managed partnership development for a small urban renewal nonprofit. He met Amara after a panel on rural innovation and approached her with what looked like humility. He said he had never heard anyone speak about service with such precision. He said most people were in love with visibility, but she seemed in love with results. He asked if he could buy her coffee. He remembered the kind she drank. Amara, who spent her life solving problems that shouted, had a weakness for people who seemed gentle. Darius seemed gentle. At first. He admired her work. He attended field visits. He carried boxes. He learned names. He sat with midwives and asked questions that sounded sincere enough to make even Amara lower her guard. When they married 3 years later, people called them a perfect match. The strategist and the spokesman. The builder and the bridge. The woman with substance and the man who could bring scale. For a while, that story looked true. Darius helped Riverlight attract more cameras, more sponsors, more invitations. Amara did not mind staying in the background. She believed growth mattered more than credit. That was her first great mistake. The second was believing Darius saw invisibility the way she did. To Amara, staying out of the spotlight meant protecting the work. To Darius, it meant the spotlight was now available. The shift did not happen in one night. It happened in signatures, in introductions, in event programs where his name appeared larger and hers disappeared lower each year until it vanished completely. It happened in magazine profiles that described Riverlight as an extension of Darius Bellows' humanitarian vision. It happened when sponsors began emailing his office instead of hers. It happened when Rita Sane joined the foundation as communications director and started rebranding every success into a cleaner, shinier, more marketable story. According to Rita, the public did not connect with muddy roads, unpaid nurses, and broken generators. They connected with leadership. They connected with a face. They connected with aspiration. and Darius was more aspirational than his wife. Evelyn Bello agreed. She always agreed whenever Amara was being erased. "People don't follow quiet women," she told Darius one Sunday after lunch, loud enough for Amara to hear from the hallway. "They admire them privately and replace them publicly. If she won't step forward, you should." Darius did not defend his wife. He never shouted at first. He only failed to correct the lie. And that is how theft often begins in marriages that later pretend they collapsed suddenly. Not with a bang, with repeated permission. By the 6th year of their marriage, Riverlight still carried its original mission, but not its original ownership. Documents were routed through Bello Impact Group. New partnerships were announced by Darius on stage. Old field workers no longer knew whether to call Amara directly because requests had to pass through the office first. Rita said it was more efficient. Evelyn said it looked more professional. Darius said growth required sacrifice. Amara told herself the mothers were still being served. She told herself the clinics were still running. She told herself names were smaller than outcomes. Then she found the contract. It was hidden in a digital folder Darius had accidentally left open on their home study computer while rushing to an interview. At first glance, it looked like another sponsorship deck. But buried under the branding slides was the transfer agreement for the Riverlight Expansion Fund due to be announced at the Lantern Hope Ball. The founder's history had been rewritten. Not shortened, not simplified, rewritten. Every early design decision, every field innovation, every donor origin note, every mention of Amara's authorship had been removed and replaced with institutional language crediting Darius Bello with conceptual leadership from inception. From inception. Amara sat in the study for a long time, with one hand on the mouse and the other pressed against her mouth. Not because she was surprised, because final proof carries a different temperature than suspicion. A few pages later, she found something worse, a private memo from Rita, recommending that Amara be excluded from future flagship events, unless her appearance could be better aligned with executive brand positioning. Evelyn had replied to the email thread with one sentence. Agreed, she drains the room. Darius had answered 31 minutes later. After the ball, she won't matter operationally. Amara read that line 4 times. Then she closed the laptop. She did not scream. She did not wake him. She did not confront anyone. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, stood barefoot on cool tile, and stared through the dark window until the outline of her own reflection stopped looking like a wife and started looking like a witness. The next morning she called Tenny. Tenny Balogan had once been Riverlight's youngest volunteer coordinator. Now she ran special events for half the city's serious charities and knew which donor lists mattered before people became publicly important. Tenny answered on the second ring. "Tell me who's attending Lantern Hope," Amara said. Tenny paused only once. Then she asked, "What exactly do you need?" "Truth," Amara said. "In the right room." By evening, Tenny had the guest list. At the bottom of the confirmed front row seating plan was one name Amara had not seen in almost 3 years. Kofi Aremu. The man who funded Riverlight before the cameras arrived. The man Darius had been trying unsuccessfully to impress for over a year. The man who hated vanity dressed as generosity. Amara almost laughed. Not because revenge had finally appeared, because arrogance had invited its own witness. She did not send Kofi a dramatic message. She sent one line. "If you still care who built Riverlight, come early and sit in front." He replied 40 minutes later, "I will." What Amara did next was not a performance. It was preparation. She gathered the original route maps from storage. She scanned the first donor letters. She located photographs from the flood season, signed field budgets, handwritten supply records, and the incorporation papers that still carried her maiden name. She called 2 senior midwives who had worked the first routes. She called the retired logistics officer who managed the second van launch. She called a doctor from Makoko who remembered exactly whose plan had cut maternal transport times in half. She asked none of them for spectacle, only presence, only honesty if honesty became necessary. Then she waited, not passively, calmly. There is a difference. And so the Lantern Hope Ball arrived. Amara dressed herself without help. The silver gown was one she had owned for years and almost never wore. It did not scream for attention. It held it. She fastened the indigo cuff around her wrist and looked at herself in the mirror long enough to remember the woman she had been before people began editing her down to convenience. When Darius saw her downstairs, he frowned. "You're wearing that bracelet?" "Yes. It looks provincial." "So does cruelty," she said. He stared at her, then smiled. The kind of smile men wear when they think the evening still belongs to them. Now, back in the ballroom, red wine drying across her dress, Amara sat through the humiliation everyone expected to break her. Darius leaned closer and lowered his voice just enough to sound intimate and cruel at once. "You should leave before people pity you." Amara turned her face toward him slowly. "You should sit down before people know you." For the first time all night, something uncertain moved behind his eyes. Then the host returned to the microphone and invited guests to prepare for the keynote presentation honoring transformational leadership in African philanthropy. Darius straightened his jacket. Rita touched his sleeve. Evelyn lifted her chin. The room tried to recover its elegance. But front-row energy had already shifted. Kofi Aremu spoke quietly to the event chair. The event chair went pale. He called someone from backstage. 2 technicians hurried toward the AV booth. Tenny, standing near the curtains with an event badge clipped to black satin, gave Amara the smallest nod. Darius noticed movement and frowned. "What's going on?" Nobody answered him. The lights dimmed. The stage glowed amber. The host smiled too carefully and announced that before the keynote, the board wished to add a special recognition segment tied to the founding story of Riverlight Maternal Outreach and the expansion fund being launched that evening. Darius blinked. That was not on the rehearsal schedule. Rita stiffened. Evelyn's smile dropped by 1 inch. Then the first image appeared on the screen. Not Darius. Amara. Younger. Sun-darkened. Standing beside a mud-splashed van with rolled-up sleeves, one hand on a root board, the other shielding her eyes from harsh afternoon light. Behind her stood 2 nurses and a diesel drum. At the bottom of the photo, scanned from an old local bulletin, were the words, "Pilot Route Director, Amara Okoye." A murmur moved through the ballroom. The second image appeared, a route map in Amara's handwriting. The third, a donor letter from Kofi Aremu's family office addressed to her directly. The fourth, a photograph of a flooded crossing, with Amara knee-deep in water, guiding equipment into a boat while Darius, years before the suits and speeches, stood half out of frame carrying 1 plastic crate. Not leading, helping. Darius stood up so abruptly his chair scraped. "What is this?" Kofi rose from the front row. It was not a dramatic movement. it was something worse. Measured authority. The room knew who he was, and when he turned toward the stage, people turned with him. His voice, when it came, was calm. "This," he said, "is record." No one spoke. Kofi looked toward Darius, then toward the crowd. "Years ago," he said, "I funded a young woman whose ideas saved women the institutions had forgotten. She asked me for tires, refrigeration, and fuel. She did not ask me for applause. I remember that because it is rare. Tonight I walked into this room and watched that same woman, insulted, stained, and treated like a guest in work that carries her fingerprints from the first mile to the last." Rita moved first. She reached for Darius's arm. "Sit down. Don't react." But panic was already climbing his throat. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "My wife and I built Riverlight together." Amara did not answer. Kofi did. "No," he said. "You married Riverlight." The ballroom went still. Evelyn whispered, "This is outrageous." Kofi turned to her with no anger at all. That is exactly what many women hear right before history is corrected. He signaled to the stage. 3 people walked out from the wings. First came Nurse Bisi, older now, still straight-backed, still wearing the practical expression of a woman too busy to worship money. Then Dr. Chuma, who had overseen the river clinics during the expansion years. Then Pastor Leke, who had signed the first community transport agreement when nobody else believed the route would survive a season. They did not come to perform. They came to confirm. Nurse Bisi took the microphone first. "Before there were sponsors," she said, "there was Amara. Before there were speeches, there were invoices she paid from her own pocket. Before there was a foundation office, there was one van and one woman who refused to let our mothers die on the road." Dr. Chuma followed. "I have sat in boardrooms where men described Riverlight as strategy. It was never strategy first. It was service first. And the first system behind that service was designed by Amara Okoye." Pastor Leke opened a worn envelope and lifted one page into the air. "This is the original local transport approval," he said. "Signed by me, requested by her, not him." The crowd did not murmur now. They watched. That is always the soundliest form of judgment. Darius looked around the room, as though searching for the version of his life that had existed 30 minutes earlier. It was gone. Even Rita had moved half a step away from him, her face already rearranging itself for survival. Kofi returned to the microphone. "There is one final matter," he said. He held up a leather folder from his table. "When my office agreed to support tonight's 20 million naira expansion pledge, we attached a founder integrity clause. Any material misrepresentation of Riverlight's origin or operational authorship voids transfer of the fund." Darius's face changed. Not embarrassment, fear. Kofi continued. "I am therefore rescinding support from Bello Impact Group, effective immediately." A sound like inhaled electricity moved through the room. Then came the final blow. "My office will honor the pledge," Kofi said, "under a new structure, led by the original founder, if she is willing." Every eye turned to Amara. Wine still stained her dress. A faint line of red had dried near her wrist beside the indigo beads. She rose slowly. No dramatic tears, no trembling speech, no revenge smile. She looked at Kofi, then at the room. And when she spoke, her voice was so calm People leaned forward to hear it. "I am willing," she said. The applause started near the back, not with the rich, with two nurses seated at a sponsored table, then one doctor, then a trustee, then a journalist. Then an entire side of the ballroom rose at once, clapping not for scandal, but for recognition long overdue. Chairs moved, hands struck harder, people stood. The sound spread under chandelier light until the room Darius had controlled all evening no longer belonged to him at all. Amara did not bask in it. She simply stood there and accepted the truth as if truth had finally arrived at its correct address. Rita left first. She picked up her silver clutch, whispered something sharp under her breath, and walked toward the exit without looking back. By morning, her team would release a statement calling her role advisory only. Evelyn remained seated for another minute, frozen by a humiliation she could neither dominate nor deny. When she finally stood, she went to her son and hissed through clenched teeth, "Fix this." But there are some collapses money cannot edit in time. Darius tried to reach Amara before she left the ballroom. He caught up to her near the side corridor where the music sounded softer and the marble reflected gold from the hall beyond. "Amara," he said, "listen to me." She stopped, not because she owed him, because endings deserve eye contact. "You could have spoken to me privately," he said. She almost smiled. "You poured wine on me publicly." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I made mistakes." "No," she said. "You made plans." He flinched. That was the first honest reaction she had seen on his face in years. "You're destroying everything," he said. Amara adjusted the fabric at her wrist and looked at him with a sadness so clean it felt merciless. "No, Darius," she said. "I built it. You only got caught standing where I left it." Then she walked away. The fallout began before dessert. Two sponsors requested immediate review of their associations with Bello Impact Group. One trustee quietly asked for copies of the AV material. A journalist who had been scheduled to profile Darius the following month asked instead for an interview about founder erasure in philanthropy. By midnight, donors were talking in clusters near the valet stand. By sunrise, the clips were circulating in private circles where reputations are damaged first and explained later. Darius called Amara 12 times the next day. She answered none of them. His texts began with outrage, then explanation, then blame, then nostalgia, then apology. By the fourth day, they turned desperate. "You know how hard I worked. You know I always meant to make it right. Don't let outsiders come between us. We can still fix the story." That last message told Amara everything. He still believed the problem was narrative, not character. Meanwhile, Kofi's office moved quickly. Lawyers reviewed the founder integrity clause. Board members requested Riverlight's original archives. Tenny helped coordinate a transition meeting in a modest conference room with no flowers, no cameras, and no sponsor wall behind the chairs. Amara arrived in a plain navy dress with a folder of route notes and 3 practical questions about fuel procurement. By the end of that week, everyone serious understood what had happened. Darius Bello had not created a miracle. He had inherited a machine built by a woman who never demanded her own reflection in its polished metal. Without that machine, his prestige looked strangely light. Project stalled.
A bank delayed renewal on one of his social development lines. 2 television invitations disappeared. One magazine replaced his cover interview with a feature titled, "The Women Who Build What Men Brand." Evelyn called relatives. Few picked up. Rita disappeared into consultancy language. And Darius, for the first time in his adult life, discovered that charm cannot survive once people begin comparing it to paper.
3 months later, on a bright afternoon with storm clouds building over the lagoon, Amara stood outside a modest new operations center, painted white and indigo. The sign above the entrance read, "Riverlight Maternal Network." No husband's surname, no executive vanity, no smiling portrait, just the work. Inside, 2 program coordinators argued good-naturedly over route efficiency. A nurse from the original pilot corridor trained new staff in emergency transfer protocol. Refrigeration units hummed in the supply room. On one wall hung the first hand-drawn route map in a simple frame, not as decoration, but as memory. Kofi visited that day without cameras. He walked through the center slowly, stopping at the framed map. "You kept it," he said. "It kept me," Amara answered. He nodded, as if that was the only correct reply. In another part of the city, Darius sat alone in a glass office that had begun to feel rented by a former version of himself. His assistant had resigned. Rita had taken other clients. His inbox held too many polite refusals and not enough invitations. On his desk lay a photograph from years earlier, one he had never really noticed until now. Amara, standing beside the first Riverlight van, boots muddy, hair tied back, smiling into sunlight. Not because anyone was watching, because the work had moved. Darius turned the photo face down. Some truths arrive like thunder. Others arrive as paperwork, witness statements, archived maps, and the calm voice of a woman too exhausted to protect a thief any longer. That was Amara's kind of truth. She did not chase revenge. She recovered authorship. She did not need to scream to become undeniable. She only needed the room to stop listening to the wrong person. That evening, as staff closed the new center and the sky darkened toward rain, Amara stood alone for a moment at the gate. She touched the indigo cuff on her wrist and listened to the city move around her. Cars, distant horns, footsteps, life continuing. A young coordinator stepped outside and asked if she was ready to go. Amara smiled. "In a minute," she said. Because some endings deserve to be felt before they are left behind. She looked once at the sign over the building, once at the road ahead, and once at the sky that smelled like coming rain. Then she turned off the gate light and walked forward. Not as a wife recovering from humiliation, not as a shadow returning to shape, but as the original builder of a thing the world had finally learned to call by its rightful name. If a quiet woman ever built the ground under someone else's glory, may the truth find her before the applause is over. What lesson did you take from this story? If something like this ever happened in your life, what would you do in that situation? And before you go, tell me where you're watching this video from. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.